The first time Tom saw her, she was on fire. Not literally, though it would take him a confused, terrified minute to figure that out. A streak of blue-white light had torn across the evening sky over his small coastal town, and when he and his bike skidded to a stop at the edge of the scorched field behind the old grain silo, he found a girl about his age standing in the middle of a smoking crater, glowing faintly, looking utterly unbothered by the fact that she had just fallen out of orbit. "You're staring," she said, in perfect English, though her voice carried an odd musical undertone, like two notes played at once. "You fell out of the sky," Tom said. It seemed like a reasonable thing to point out. "I did not fall," she said, with the wounded dignity of someone twice her age. "My escape pod experienced a minor guidance malfunction during a routine cultural exchange descent." Tom, age 11, did not know what most of those words meant together. "So, you fell out of the sky?" She glared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. That was how it started. Not with fireworks or destiny or any of the grand things storytellers like to claim. It started with a girl named Ada, heir to something called the Starborn Empire, stuck on Earth for a year as part of a program designed to teach young Starborn nobility about lesser civilizations, and a boy named Tom, who had absolutely no idea he'd just made the most important friend of his life. Ada was, by her own admission, terrible at being normal. She corrected teachers. She refused to lose at anything. She treated every conversation like a negotiation she intended to win. The other kids at school found her exhausting within a week. Tom found her fascinating. "Why do you always have to be right?" he asked her once, after she'd reduced a substitute teacher to stammering silence over a geography lesson. "Because I am the heir to an empire of 11,000 worlds," Ada said. "Being right is somewhat the job description." "Yeah, but you're not empress of this sandbox," Tom said, nodding at the playground sandbox where a much smaller, much angrier debate was unfolding between two 7-year-olds. "Maybe try being wrong sometimes, see what happens." She tried it. Exactly once, letting a younger kid win an argument about whether dinosaurs could swim. The kid had beamed at her like she'd given him a medal. Ada had stood there faintly baffled, turning the feeling over like a puzzle box. "That was strange," she told Tom afterward. "I didn't lose anything, but it felt like I gained something." "Yeah," Tom said. "That's friendship, genius. Welcome to it." Over the months that followed, Tom taught her things no royal tutor ever had. How to build a treehouse out of mismatched scrap wood because you didn't have the correct materials, and how that often turned out better anyway. How a broken plan wasn't a failure. It was just an invitation to make a new plan, usually a more interesting one. How sometimes the smartest move in a game wasn't the most efficient one, but the one your opponent would never expect, because they were too busy doing the math you weren't doing. "Starborn strategy is built on probability," Ada told him one rainy afternoon, hunched over a battered chessboard in Tom's garage. "We calculate the optimal outcome and pursue it without deviation." "Sounds boring," Tom said, and moved his knight somewhere no sane chess strategy would recommend. Ada stared at the board, recalculated, stared again. "That's an absurd move." "Yep. It shouldn't work." "Probably doesn't," Tom agreed cheerfully. "But you've spent 30 seconds trying to figure out why I'd do something so dumb instead of just taking my queen. Sometimes confusing people buys you time. My grandpa taught me that. He was in the army. She lost that game. It was, she would later tell him, one of her favorite memories of the entire year. The cultural exchange program was supposed to last 1 year, and for 10 months, it did. Ada learned to ride a bike, badly. Tom learned 3 words of Starborn, court etiquette, all of which he immediately used incorrectly to make her laugh. They built a tree fort they named, with 11-year-old gravity, Fort Ultimate. They promised, the way children promise things, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that they would be best friends forever. Then 2 months early, the recall came. Ada's father, the Emperor, needed her home. There was no explanation, no warning, no time. A shuttle descended into the same scorched field where she had first arrived. and Ada was given exactly 1 hour to say goodbye to the only true friend she had ever made. "I'll come back," she told Tom, gripping his hand so tightly it hurt. "I promise. I'll find a way." "I know you will," Tom said, because he believed it completely, the way only a child can believe something with no evidence at all. He pressed a small object into her palm, a cheap plastic compass from a gas station vending machine, the kind that came in a clear capsule for a quarter. "So you don't get lost finding your way back." Ada had laughed and cried at the same time. She kept that compass for 20 years. The shuttle rose into the night sky, and Tom stood in the scorched field until it became a star, and then until it became nothing at all. He didn't know, as he walked home alone in the dark, that he would spend the next 2 decades becoming something far stranger than he could have imagined, and that somewhere among those 11,000 worlds, a princess was about to spend 20 years doing the very same thing. Neither of them knew yet that the universe was not finished with their promise. 20 years is a long time for a promise to survive. It is an even longer time for an empire to survive without a single defeat, which was exactly the problem now facing the Starborn Empire, because that long unbroken streak had just ended, catastrophically, 11 times in a row. Princess Ada, no longer a girl falling out of a crater, but a woman with the weight of 11,000 worlds pressing into her shoulders, stood in the war room of the Imperial flagship Selene and watched the holographic display update with the 12th defeat in 3 months. "The 6th Fleet is gone," reported Admiral Karen, her voice flat with the particular exhaustion of someone who had said similar sentences too many times recently. "Same pattern as the others. Our formations were optimal. Our strategy was sound. They simply didn't fight the way the simulations predicted they would." "They never do," Ada said quietly. The enemy had a name that made Starborn officers visibly uncomfortable to say aloud: the Void Collective. They had emerged from the unmapped dark between galactic arms 2 years ago, and in that time they had done something no force in recorded Starborn history had managed. They had made the Empire's perfect probability-optimized military strategy completely useless. Starborn warfare had been refined over 1,000 years into something close to mathematics. Feed in enough data about an enemy, run the simulations, and the optimal strategy would reveal itself with near total certainty. It had won them 11,000 worlds. It had never failed them. Until now. The Void Collective didn't behave like a rational actor. Their ships made decisions that defied probability models, sacrificing tactically superior positions for moves that looked, by every calculation the Empire's greatest strategic minds could produce, like mistakes. Except they weren't mistakes. They were a different kind of intelligence entirely, one the Empire's perfectly logical war machine simply could not predict. "Father," Ada said, turning to the Emperor, who sat at the head of the war table looking older than she had ever seen him. "We need to consider something the High Council will not want to hear." Emperor Solanvey raised a tired hand, granting permission before she'd even finished the sentence. 20 years on the throne had taught him to recognize when his daughter was about to say something both correct and unwelcome. "We need help from outside the Empire," Ada said, "specifically from Earth." The silence that followed was not polite. "Earth," repeated High Strategist Doman, in the tone of a man who had just been asked to consult a child's coloring book for battlefield tactics. "Your Highness, with respect, Earth is a developing world. Their technology lags ours by centuries. What could they possibly offer that our finest military minds cannot?" "Unpredictability," Ada said. "Our entire strategic doctrine is built on optimizing toward the most probable outcome. The Void Collective has learned to exploit exactly that. They know what we'll do because we're built to do the rational thing. Humans don't fight that way. I've seen it. I lived among them." "You lived among children, Your Highness, 20 years ago," Doman said. "A single year on a backwater world hardly qualifies as military analysis." It was a fair point, and it stung, more than Ada wanted to admit, because the truth was that her certainty wasn't built on strategic analysis at all. It was built on a memory of a boy moving a knight where no sane player would move it, and winning anyway because he understood something the math didn't capture. that the smartest move was sometimes the one nobody expected you to make. "I'm not asking the Council to abandon our doctrine," Ada said. "I'm asking for one thing. Reach out to Earth's governing coalition. Request a military advisory team. If I'm wrong, we've lost nothing but pride. If I'm right, we may have found the only weapon the Void Collective hasn't learned to predict. The chaos." Emperor studied his daughter for a long moment. He remembered, though he rarely spoke of it, how she had returned from that exchange year changed, softer in some ways, sharper in others, carrying a strange little plastic compass she still, 20 years later, kept on a chain around her neck and never once mentioned to anyone. "Send the request," the Emperor said. The Council erupted into protest. Ada didn't hear most of it. She was looking at the compass in her hand, turning it slowly, the way she had every difficult night for 2 decades, and thinking of a boy in a scorched field who had told her to never get lost finding her way back. "I'm trying, Tom," she thought. "I really hope this works." 3 weeks later, a single unmarked transport ship requested clearance to dock with the Selene. The starborn officers monitoring its approach noted with some confusion that its trajectory was, by every standard model, deeply inefficient. It looped twice, dropped speed for no detectable tactical reason, and approached from an angle no rational pilot would choose. "Their navigation is a disaster," one ensign muttered. Ada, watching the same readout, felt something flicker in her chest that she hadn't felt in 20 years. It was something close to hope, and something closer to recognition. The transport docked. The bay doors opened, and the man who walked through them, dressed in unremarkable human field gear, carrying no weapon and no obvious authority, introduced himself in a voice that made the entire room go quiet. "Commander Ghost," he said, "I hear you've got a problem only a human can fix." Ada did not recognize his face. 20 years had reshaped it. Older, harder, marked with the kind of weariness that only comes from decades of impossible decisions. But something in the way he stood, weight shifted slightly onto his left foot, hands loose and ready, struck a chord in her she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that for 3 more episodes than she'd like to admit, she was wrong both times. Nobody in the Empire's command structure liked Commander Ghost, and Commander Ghost did not appear to care even slightly. Within his first week aboard, the Selene, he had overridden 2 standard defensive protocols, ignored an entire tactical briefing in favor of sketching something on a napkin, and told High Strategist Doman to his face that the Empire's simulation models were beautiful, perfectly logical, and about as useful against the Void Collective as a chess strategy is against a toddler throwing the board across the room. Doman had not appreciated the comparison. Ada, watching from across the briefing room, had nearly choked, trying not to laugh. "You find that amusing, Your Highness?" Doman had asked, stiff with offense. "I find it accurate," Ada said, and did not elaborate. Ghost's methods were, by every starborn military standard, reckless. He didn't run full simulations before committing to a plan. He made decisions based on what he called gut instinct, supplemented by something he called creative problem solving, which seemed to mostly involve asking what the enemy would least expect and then doing exactly that, consequences be damned. It should not have worked. It worked. In a skirmish along the Vena border, Ghost ordered a fleet of 6 ships to feign a total engine failure, a tactic so absurd that the Void Collective vessels, which had learned to read and counter every rational starborn maneuver, hesitated for nearly 90 seconds trying to determine what new strategy this represented. 90 seconds was more than enough time for Ghost's real attack. 3 cloaked fighters that had been drifting, powered down, disguised as space debris for the past 6 hours, to strike the enemy's command vessel from point-blank range. It was the Empire's first decisive victory against the Void Collective in 3 months. How? Doman demanded afterward, genuinely bewildered rather than hostile for the first time. Did you know that would work? There's no precedent, no data, no simulation could have predicted that outcome. That's the point, Ghost said. If your simulations could predict it, so could theirs. The trick isn't finding the best move, it's finding the move nobody, including your own side half the time, saw coming. Ada found herself seeking out his briefings more than strictly necessary for her role as the Emperor's strategic liaison. She told herself it was professional interest. She mostly believed it. There were things about him that nagged at her in small, persistent ways. The way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking through a problem, exactly the way a boy used to do over a chessboard in a garage that smelled like sawdust and rain. The way he deflected every personal question with a joke. Deployed, at exactly the moment the conversation got too close to something real. The scar along his left forearm, which she glimpsed once when he rolled up his sleeve, in almost exactly the place a boy had once cut himself building a treehouse and refused, with enormous dignity, to admit it hurt. "You're staring again," Ghost said one evening, catching her gaze across the strategy table after the rest of the staff had filed out. The room was quiet, lit only by the blue glow of the tactical display. "You said something familiar," Ada said. Carefully. "About chess, about confusing your opponent to buy time." Something flickered across his face, there and gone so fast she almost doubted she'd seen it. Common enough idea. Sun Tzu, more or less. Sun Tzu didn't move a knight into an objectively terrible position purely to make his opponent overthink it, Ada said. "Someone very specific taught me that phrase, word for word." Ghost was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual easy confidence. "Lots of people say similar things, Your Highness. It's not exactly a rare strategy." "No," Ada agreed. "But it's a rare way of saying it." He didn't answer that. He gathered his data slate, offered a brief formal nod, and left the room more quickly than the conversation strictly required. Ada sat alone with the hum of the tactical display and the small plastic compass against her sternum, and allowed herself, for the first time in 20 years, to hope for something she had no right to expect. She didn't tell anyone what she suspected, partly because it sounded, even in her own head, like something from one of the old Earth storybooks Tom used to read her, too neat, too convenient, too much like a happy ending arriving exactly when she needed one most. Partly because some small, frightened part of her could not bear the possibility of being wrong. But she watched him, and the longer she watched, the more the pieces refused to stop fitting together. She watched him win an argument with 3 senior A officers by doing something so absurd, proposing they let the enemy win a minor outpost specifically so the Void Collective would overextend their supply lines chasing the apparent victory, that the officers initially thought he was joking. He wasn't. It worked. The lost outpost became the trap that crippled an entire enemy battle group 2 weeks later. She watched him late one night in the officers' mess, building something out of spare components and discarded packaging, not because anyone had asked him to, but because, as he put it, "An idle brain is a dangerous brain, Your Highness, and a busy hand keeps it from getting any worse ideas." What he built was small and crooked and utterly impractical, a tiny scale model of a fort made of whatever scraps had been on the table. He'd called it, without apparent irony, Fort Ultimate 2. Ada had to leave the room before he saw her face. It was during the battle for the Threely system, the largest engagement of the war so far, with the fate of 3 populated worlds hanging on its outcome, that the truth finally found its way into open air, in the worst possible circumstances, at the worst possible moment. The battle for Threelis began the way most disasters begin, with a plan that looked perfect right up until it wasn't. The Void Collective had committed nearly 70% of its known fleet strength to the system, a scale of engagement the Empire had never faced before. Ada stood on the bridge of the Yao, Selene alongside her father, watching the tactical display fill with hostile contacts like a slow, spreading stain. "Their numbers exceed our projections by 40%, Admiral Karen reported, voice tight. "If they commit fully, even Ghosts." "Tactics may not be enough. Where is Commander Ghost?" the Emperor asked. "Forward command, leading the strike wing personally," Karen said. "Against my strong recommendation, Your Majesty." Ada was already moving toward the comm station before she'd consciously decided to. "Patch me through to his channel." A moment later, Ghost's voice crackled through, calm despite the chaos audible behind it. The whine of engines pushed past safety limits, the controlled tension of a man doing several impossible things simultaneously. "Talk to me, Solan. I'm a little busy." "The Void Fleet is exceeding projections," Ada said. "You need to fall back to secondary formation." "Negative. Secondary formation is exactly what they're expecting now. We used it twice last week. I need something they haven't seen." A pause, and then, almost to himself, "Need a move nobody saw coming." "Like throwing the board across the room," Ada said before she could stop herself. The silence on the other end of the channel lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. "What did you say?" Ghost's voice had changed, stripped of its usual easy command, suddenly, nakedly uncertain in a way she had never once heard from him. "You told Doman that your tactics were as unpredictable to the Void Collective as a toddler throwing a chessboard across the room," Ada said, heart hammering against the small plastic compass at her throat. "That's not a saying. That's not sunny. Tsu. That's a memory." Another pause. Through the comm, she could hear the dull roar of distant weapons fire, the controlled chaos of a battle balanced on a knife's edge. "Tom?" Ada said. The word hit the bridge crew like a physical shock. Several officers turned. The Emperor's hand resting on the back of the command chair went very still. For a long, suspended moment, there was only static and distant gunfire. Then, "Took you long enough, genius," said Commander Ghost, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with 20 years finally catching up to him at once. There was no time for the reunion the moment deserved. The Void Collective's main strike force was bearing down on the three-less defensive line, and somewhere in the chaos of that knowledge, both of them, a princess and a soldier who had once been a boy and a girl in a garage with a chessboard, understood that grief and joy and 20 years of separation would all have to wait. "Talk strategy with me," Ada said. "Right now, like the old days. What's the move nobody sees coming?" And there, in the middle of the largest battle of the war, something extraordinary happened. Princess Ada, heir to the Starborn Empire, trained from birth in the rigid mathematics of optimal strategy, began thinking the way an 11-year-old boy had once taught her to think in a garage that smelled like rain. "Their whole strategy depends on reading our patterns," Tom said. "Fighters," screaming past his viewport. "We've been feeding them patterns for 2 years. What if, instead of trying to out-calculate them, we just stopped calculating? Did something with no pattern at all? Something that doesn't even make tactical sense unless you already know the ending." "Like Fort Ultimate," Ada said, the old name rising unbidden, surprising them both. "Like Fort Ultimate," Tom agreed, and she could hear, even through the comm static, that he was smiling. "Remember the blueprint? Built out of whatever scrap we had, in whatever shape it ended up taking, instead of the perfect fort some adult would have designed." "You want to build a battle plan out of scrap," Ada said. "I want to build a battle plan out of everything," Tom said. "Every mismatched, unconventional, technically inferior asset in this fleet that your perfect Starborn doctrine has been quietly ignoring for 2 years because it didn't fit the optimal model. Decommissioned ships, civilian freighters, that weird experimental drive technology your engineers shelved because it was inefficient. None of it makes sense alone. None of it fits a pattern. That's exactly why it'll work. It took 4 desperate, brilliant hours to assemble." Ada argued with her father, with Doman, with half the council, pulling together a force built from the discarded and the unconventional. Old freighters retrofitted as decoys, an experimental drive system too erratic. For standard combat repurposed specifically because its erratic signature could not be predicted. Civilian volunteer pilots whose complete lack of formal Starborn battle training meant they fought in ways no simulation had ever modeled. It was, by every traditional measure of Starborn warfare, an act of madness. It was exactly what the Void Collective could not predict. The battle that followed would be studied by military historians on 2 worlds for the next century, and neither side's analyst would ever fully agree on how to explain it, because the truth was almost embarrassingly simple. It worked precisely because it should not have. Tom led the strike personally, flying one of the retrofitted freighters. Himself, a battered, unglamorous vessel he'd insisted on naming, over the strenuous objections of the engineering corps, Fort Ultimate. Ada coordinated from the Selen's bridge, feeding him real-time data and, more importantly, refusing every instinct her training screamed at her to fall back into safe, optimal, predictable formations. "They're shifting to intercept your decoy. Freighters," Ada reported, watching the enemy formation twist in confusion. "Their pattern recognition systems can't classify the threat level. They don't know if they're facing a feint or a real attack." "Good," Tom said. "Keep them confused. A little longer." The experimental drive ships, erratic, unreliable, exactly the kind of technology Starborn Doctrine had dismissed as too inefficient to deploy, darted through the battle in trajectories that defied every rational tactical model because they weren't being flown rationally. They were being flown by civilian volunteers with no formal training, making decisions based on instinct and improvisation rather than simulation, exactly the unpredictable variable the Void Collective's strategic intelligence had never learned. To counter. The Void Collective's perfect, adaptive, pattern-breaking strategy, the same strategy that had shattered 11 Starborn fleets in a row, began, for the first time in the war, to falter against an opponent it could not categorize. At all. "Now," Tom said. "Ada, now, the signal." Ada gave the order, and the Empire's true strike force, hidden until that moment behind a deliberately chaotic screen of misdirection, emerged from concealment and struck the Void Collective's overextended, confused formation at its most vulnerable point. It was not a clean victory. It was messy, costly, and far closer than anyone aboard the Selen would have liked. 3 ships were lost. Tom's freighter took catastrophic damage in the battle's final minutes, and for nearly 90 seconds, the longest 90 seconds of Ada's life, his channel went silent and his ship's icon on the tactical display flickered, failed, and very nearly vanished from the grid entirely. "Tom," Ada said, gripping the edge of the comm station so hard her knuckles went white. "Tom, answer me! Tom!" The silence stretched. The bridge crew, who 20 minutes ago had not known their commander's real name, now watched their princess, with the particular aching attention reserved for moments that might become tragedy. Then, static. A cough. A voice, rough but unmistakably alive. "Relax, genius. Told you I'd find my way back." Ada laughed. And the laugh broke apart into something closer to a sob halfway through, and she didn't care in that moment who on the bridge was watching. The Void Collective's fleet, broken and disorganized by a strategy their adaptive intelligence had never been built to anticipate, began a full retreat within the hour. It was not the final battle of the war. That would come 3 weeks later, in a smaller, quieter engagement that ended with the Void Collective's command structure finally, fully collapsing under the weight of an empire that had, at last, learned to stop fighting like a machine and start fighting like the people defending it. But the battle for Thralis was the turning point, and everyone aboard the Selen knew it, and most of them, though they would never say so in any official report, understood that the turning point had less to do with tactics than with 2 old friends remembering, after 20 years, exactly how to trust each other. Tom's damaged freighter limped back to the Selen's docking bay 3 hours later, scorched and venting atmosphere from a dozen minor hull breaches, looking, Ada thought as she watched it approach, exactly as battered and held together with hope as the original Fort Ultimate had looked after that one terrible summer storm 20 years ago. She was waiting at the docking bay doors when they opened. Tom stepped through, smoke-stained, exhausted, missing the careful Commander Ghost mask he'd worn for weeks. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all, because 20 years is a long time to prepare a sentence for a moment like this, and somehow, faced with it, every sentence Ada had ever rehearsed simply evaporated. "You got taller," she finally said, which was, of everything she could have said, possibly the least adequate. "You got scarier," Tom said. 11,000 worlds. I always knew you'd end up running something enormous." "You faked your own death by 90 seconds of radio silence," Ada said. "I should have you court-martialed." "You don't have that authority, Your Highness." "I'm a princess. I'm fairly sure I can invent the authority." He laughed, the same laugh somehow, despite 20 years and a war and 1,000 impossible things between them. and then he was crossing the last few feet between them, and Ada was crying into the shoulder of a uniform that smelled like smoke and engine coolant, and neither of them said anything else for a long, long time, because some reunions don't need words. They just need the people involved to finally stop being apart. The peace that followed the war was not instant, and it was not simple. Peace rarely is. But it was, against every prediction the Empire's old strategic doctrine would have produced, real. The Void Collective's remnant forces, leaderless and fractured after the loss of their command structure, scattered into the dark spaces between galactic arms from which they'd originally emerged. Whether they would return one day was a question Ada's military advisors debated endlessly. For now, 11,000 worlds breathed easier than they had in 2 years. The Council, somewhat to Ada's amusement, had reversed its position on Earth with the swift, shameless efficiency of institutions everywhere. High strategist Doman, who had once compared Tom's tactics unfavorably to a toddler with a chessboard, now spearheaded a formal proposal for what he called doctrinal flexibility integration, which was, Ada noted privately, simply a very official way of saying, let's learn to think like humans sometimes. You realize, Tom said, watching Doman present an elaborate slideshow on the strategic value of unpredictability to a room of visibly uncomfortable senior officers, that he's basically just describing playing it by ear, with footnotes. 11,000 worlds run on footnotes, Ada said. Let the man have his footnotes. The formal alliance between Earth and the Starborn Empire was signed 3 months later, in a ceremony notable mostly for how spectacularly it deviated from traditional Starborn protocol. Ada had insisted, against considerable institutional resistance, that the treaty include a clause establishing permanent cultural exchange programs between the two civilizations, modeled deliberately on the very program that had brought an 11-year-old princess to a small coastal Earth town 20 years earlier. Some kid is going to fall out of the sky into someone's backyard, Tom said, reading the clause over her shoulder, and scare the absolute daylights out of some other kid who has no idea what's about to happen to the next 20 years of his life. I can only hope they handle it as gracefully as you did, Ada said. I called you a girl who fell out of the sky, and you called my entire planet a backwater world, if I recall. I was 11. I have grown immensely as a person. You're still wearing the compass, Tom said, nodding to the small plastic object on its chain, worn smooth and faded after 2 decades of handling. Ada's hand went to it without thinking, the way it always did. You told me not to get lost finding my way back. Did it work? She looked at him. Not Commander Ghost, not the legendary human strategist whose unconventional tactics had saved an empire, but simply Tom, the boy who had never once cared that she was a princess, who had taught her that the smartest move was sometimes the one nobody expected, who had kept a 20-year-old promise through a war and a galaxy and more loss than either of them liked to discuss out loud. I think, Ada said, it worked exactly as well as it was always going to. They stood together at the observation window of the Solane, watching Earth and 1,000 star-born worlds bound together by treaty and trust and the unlikely, improbable, beautifully illogical fact of a friendship that had refused, against every reasonable calculation, to die. Somewhere in the years that followed, historians on both worlds would write extensively about the war against the Void Collective, the tactics, the technology, the political maneuvering that had finally brought 2 civilizations together. Most of those accounts would mention Commander Ghost's unconventional strategies and Princess Ada's pivotal decision to seek human aid as the turning points of the conflict. Almost none of them would mention a battered plastic compass, a tree, fort built from scrap wood and called, with absolute 11-year-old confidence, Fort Ultimate. None of them would record a chess game lost on purpose, or a promise made in a scorched field under a rising shuttle, or the particular, unglamorous courage it takes to keep believing in someone for 20 years with absolutely no evidence that you'll ever see them again. But Ada knew. And somewhere, flying a battered freighter still proudly bearing its ridiculous name, so did Tom. The greatest empire among the stars had been saved in the end, not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by something far older and far simpler. Two people who had once promised each other they would find their way back and who had, against every reasonable calculation in either civilization's history, kept that promise. It turned out to be the only strategy that ever really mattered. The end.